When you live with someone for more than 10 years, it seems like you know them. That if anyone would betray you, it would be your wife. Well, that's what I thought. Until I found out that she actually had another man. For 8 months. Want to know how I found out? Hold on tight. I never thought I'd be the guy telling a story like this. You hear about it happening to other men. On the news, in movies, on those late-night radio shows where broken-hearted callers spill their guts to some stranger. But you never think it'll be you. You tell yourself that your marriage, your life is different. That your wife, the woman you built a home with, raised kids with, would never do something like that. I used to believe that too. But life has a cruel way of showing you just how naive you really are. It started with little things. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic. Just small changes, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention. My wife, Sarah, has always been difficult. She's never been the warm, affectionate type. Not even when we first got married. I used to joke that she had a cat's personality. Aloof, distant, only showing affection on her terms. But I loved her anyway. I thought I understood her. I thought I knew the way her mind worked, that if I was patient, if I gave her space when she needed it, she'd always come back to me. But lately something was off. She was more distant than usual, distracted, like she was living in some other reality that had nothing to do with me or the kids. I'd be talking to her, telling her about my day, and she'd nod absent-mindedly, eyes glued to her phone. She was always on that damn thing now. Not scrolling social media or reading articles like before, no, she was texting. Constantly. I'd ask her about it and she'd shrug. Just work stuff, she'd say. Or, it's nothing important. At first, I believed her. I had no reason not to. She worked as a freelance designer, and sometimes clients messaged her at odd hours. But then I started noticing how she'd angle the screen away from me when I walked into the room. How she'd suddenly lock her phone when I got too close. Then there were the late nights. Sarah had always been a night owl, but she used to spend those late hours watching TV, reading, or working in her home office. Now, she stayed up with her phone pressed to her face, whispering into it like she was afraid someone might hear. When I asked who she was talking to, she looked almost irritated. Just a friend, she said. I should have pressed harder. I should have demanded answers. But instead, I let it slide. Because the alternative, the idea that my wife might be lying to me, was too painful to even consider. Then she started forgetting things. Important things. Our son's soccer tournament? She missed it entirely. Our anniversary. Barely acknowledged. Even little things like what we talked about the night before seemed to slip through her mind like sand through fingers. It was like she wasn't even here anymore. Like her body was in our home, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I found her sitting alone in the living room, staring at the dark TV screen. She didn't even notice me at first. I stood there for a long moment, just watching her, trying to understand what was going on in her head. Finally, I asked, "Sarah, is everything okay?" She blinked, like she'd forgotten I existed. Then she sighed. "I don't know, David. Sometimes I just feel disconnected." "From what?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. "Everything," she said softly. "You, the kids, this house, my life." I wanted to ask what she meant, to beg her to explain. But something in her eyes stopped me. There was no warmth there, no regret, just a quiet resignation. Like she'd already made peace with something I hadn't even begun to understand. Couldn't let it go. Maybe another man would have ignored the signs, convinced himself he was overthinking things. But I knew my wife. Or at least I thought I did. Sarah had always been distant, yes, but never like this. Never so completely removed from me, from the kids, from everything we had built. That night, after our conversation, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me. I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, as if nothing in her world was wrong. Meanwhile, my mind was racing, twisting itself into knots, trying to piece together what was happening to my marriage. The phone. That was the key. She was always on it, always guarding it like it contained some precious secret. And maybe it did. The next morning, as she was getting ready for work, I casually asked, "Hey, can I borrow your phone for a second? Mine's dead, and I need to check something real quick." She froze, just for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. Then she forced a smile and said, "Use your laptop." It wasn't the words that got me. It was the way she said them. Too fast, too defensive. And just like that, my suspicions solidified into something heavier, something more real. That day at work, I could barely focus. My thoughts kept circling back to Sarah, to her strange behavior, to that damned phone she never let out of her sight. I ran through all the possibilities in my head, searching for a logical explanation that didn't involve infidelity. Maybe she was dealing with some kind of personal crisis she hadn't told me about. Maybe she was depressed. Maybe she was, hell, I don't know, going through some midlife crisis where she needed to detach from the world for a while. I had to find proof. Not because I wanted to catch her, but because I needed to know. I needed something concrete, something undeniable, so I couldn't keep lying to myself. An opportunity came sooner than I expected. That weekend, Sarah was in the shower, and for the first time in weeks, she'd left her phone on the nightstand. Unlocked. I opened her messages, and there it was. A name I didn't recognize. A man. The messages weren't explicit, not at first. Just a long, drawn-out conversation filled with inside jokes, little complaints about life, about me, about the emptiness she felt. Then, deeper in the thread, the tone shifted. I can't stop thinking about last night. Sarah's reply, me neither. I kept scrolling. More messages, plans, meeting times, references to hotels. I put the phone down. My head was spinning. She was cheating on me. The realization hit me so hard. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. This wasn't some vague suspicion anymore. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. It was happening. My wife, the woman I had devoted my life to, the mother of my children, was having an affair. And not just any affair, an emotional one, a physical one, a complete betrayal. I heard the water shut off in the bathroom. I had seconds to decide what to do. My first instinct was to confront her right then and there, to throw the phone at her feet and demand an explanation. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the sheer shock of it all, or maybe, deep down, I wanted to know more before I made my move. I put the phone back exactly where I found it and walked out of the room. I needed time to think. I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do. I can finally breathe when I'm with you. How long had this been going on? Who was this man? What did she mean when she said she felt empty? Was that just an excuse? Or had she been unhappy for years without telling me? I watched her carefully now that I knew. I expected to see guilt in her eyes, some sign of remorse. But there was nothing. If anything, she looked lighter, less tense, like she was relieved. Sunday night, after the kids went to bed, she sat across from me on the couch, scrolling through her phone, probably texting him. Sarah. I said, my voice even. She looked up. Yeah. I studied her for a moment, wondering how I'd been so blind. Are you happy? Her expression didn't change, but she hesitated just for a split second. Then she shrugged. I don't know. Why? You've been distant lately, distracted. I want to know if something's wrong. She sighed, rubbing her forehead. I told you before, David. I just feel disconnected sometimes, like I'm stuck in a life I don't recognize. A life you don't recognize? My voice was sharper than I intended. We built this life together, Sarah. This house, our family. You don't recognize it. She shook her head. You wouldn't understand. That phrase. She'd said it before. It made my skin crawl. Try me, I said. She stared at me, her fingers tightening around her phone. For a brief moment, I thought she might actually open up, tell me the truth. But then she just sighed and stood up. I'm tired, she murmured, walking toward the bedroom. And yet, she still went to bed next to me, still acted like my wife, still played the role of mother to our kids. The next morning, after she left for work, I decided to dig deeper. Checking her phone again was out of the question. She had probably set up a lock screen by now. But there were other ways. First, I checked our shared bank account. I handled most of the finances, so she probably assumed I wouldn't notice anything unusual. And at first, I didn't. Groceries, gas, occasional online shopping. All normal. Then I saw it. 2 separate hotel charges. Different dates, a few weeks apart. Not during any trips, not during any events I would have known about. She had met him there. Next, I checked our phone records. Sarah's number was listed under our family plan, which meant I could see her call and text history. I didn't have access to the content of her messages, but the number was there. The same one from the texts I had read. They talked every day, sometimes multiple times a day. Calls that lasted an hour or more. This wasn't just a fling. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I needed to know who this guy was. A quick reverse lookup on the number gave me a name. Daniel Carter. I didn't recognize it. I dug deeper. social media, LinkedIn, anything that could tell me who this bastard was. And when I found him, my stomach dropped. Daniel Carter, 42 years old, married, 2 kids. He wasn't just some random guy. He was Sarah's old college friend. Now it all made sense. The way she had been talking about feeling disconnected. The late-night texting, the guarded phone, the emotional distance. She wasn't just cheating. She was reconnecting with someone from her past. Someone she felt understood her in a way I didn't. I sat there, staring at his picture, my hands shaking with rage. What the hell was I going to do about it? I sat in my office for hours, staring at Daniel Carter's picture, trying to process what I had just uncovered. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some random guy she met at work or the gym. He was someone she had history with. Someone who, in some twisted way, had never really left her life. How long had this been going on? Had she been thinking about him for years? Was I just the guy she settled for while secretly wishing she had ended up with him instead? The thoughts made me sick. I knew I had to confront her, but I also knew that if I went in blind, she'd lie. Sarah was already skilled at deception. She had been doing it for months, maybe longer. If I didn't have undeniable proof, she'd gaslight me, twist the story, make me feel like I was crazy. That night, I acted normal. I helped the kids with their homework, asked Sarah about her day, even sat next to her on the couch while she scrolled through her phone, probably texting him. It took everything in me not to grab the phone out of her hands and smash it against the wall. Instead, I kept my cool. I needed her to think I was still in the dark. The next day, I took off work and followed her. I felt ridiculous at first, like some paranoid husband in a bad movie. But deep down, I knew what I was doing wasn't paranoia. It was confirmation. Sarah had told me she had a client meeting in the afternoon. She left the house dressed a little nicer than usual. Nothing too obvious, but I noticed. A little more makeup, a blouse I hadn't seen in a while. I waited 10 minutes after she left, then got in my car and followed her. She didn't go to a client meeting. She drove across town to a small coffee shop, parked, waited, and then he arrived. Daniel Carter. He was taller than me, leaner, dark hair, well-dressed. He looked like the kind of guy who spent his days giving motivational speeches about finding your true self. Sarah stepped out of the car. The way she looked at him, it was different, warmer, softer, like she was seeing someone she actually wanted to be with. I watched as they sat at an outside table, leaning in close, talking like they were the only 2 people in the world. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. Their body language said enough. Then, after about 40 minutes, she reached across the table and took his hand. Just for a second. This wasn't just some casual affair. She wasn't just sleeping with him. She loved him. Or at least she thought she did. By the time Sarah got back, I had calmed myself down. Barely. She walked through the door, dropping her purse on the table like it was just another normal day. "How was your meeting?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She didn't even hesitate. "It was fine." I took a deep breath. "Sarah?" I said carefully. "Are you happy?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. "David, we already talked about this." "No, you talked. You keep telling me you feel disconnected, but you won't explain why." I looked her in the eyes. "If you're unhappy with me, just say it." For a second, she looked caught off guard. But then she shook her head. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me the truth," I said. She crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "Why are you acting like this?" I almost laughed. Why am I acting like this? I wanted to lay it all out right then, to tell her I knew about Daniel, about the messages, about the hotel rooms. I wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she couldn't lie her way out of this. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Every morning, I woke up next to a woman who was lying to my face. Every night, I ate dinner with someone who was sneaking off to be with another man. And every moment in between, I was playing the role of the oblivious husband while she continued her affair, thinking I was too stupid to notice. But I noticed. I noticed everything. Sarah was getting sloppy. Maybe she thought I'd never suspect her. Maybe she thought I was too dull, too trusting, too devoted to ever believe she was capable of this. Whatever the reason, she had stopped covering her tracks as well as before. She left her phone unattended more often. She stopped making excuses when she worked late. She even smelled different sometimes. Subtle traces of cologne that sure as hell wasn't mine. And the worst part? She still wouldn't just admit it. She kept playing the game, acting like my wife, sleeping in our bed, tucking our kids in at night, while carrying on with him. I needed more proof. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I put a tracker on her car. It wasn't hard. A simple GPS device, small enough to be hidden under the dashboard. It linked to an app on my phone, letting me see exactly where she went and when. If she was meeting Daniel, I'd know. If she was lying about her schedule, I'd have proof. 2 days later, I got what I was looking for. She told me she was going out for dinner with a friend. Some woman from her old job I had met once or twice. She even put on a show about how it's been forever since we caught up, and how you should order takeout with the kids. I nodded, playing along. Then I watched her drive away. The moment she was out of sight, I checked the tracker. She wasn't heading to a restaurant. She was driving toward a hotel that I felt something inside me turn ice cold. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and followed her. It didn't take long to get there. I parked a few spots away. 5 minutes later, another car pulled up. Daniel. She stepped out, looking around as if to make sure no one saw her. Then she walked toward the hotel entrance. He followed. I waited. 10 minutes. Then 20. Then 30. Enough time for them to get comfortable. Enough time for them to do whatever the hell they came here to do. Then I got out of my car and walked inside. The front desk clerk barely looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" I gave him my most casual smile. "Yeah, my buddy Daniel Carter just checked in. He told me to meet him, but I forgot the room number." The guy hesitated. "I can't give out guest information, sir." I nodded like I understood. Then I slid a 50 across the counter. "I won't tell if you won't." He hesitated for another second. Then he sighed, glanced at the computer, and muttered, "Room 214. Thanks." I took the elevator up. This was it. The moment everything changed. I stopped in front of room 214, took a deep breath. Then I knocked. A long pause. Then movement. A muffled voice. A few seconds later, the door cracked open, just enough for Sarah to peek out. The moment she saw me, her face drained of color. I didn't say a word. I just pushed the door open and walked inside. Daniel was sitting on the bed, his shirt half unbuttoned. When he saw me, he jumped to his feet, his face going pale. "What the hell?" Sarah grabbed my arm. "David, listen." "How long?" "David, please, I can explain." "How long?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Daniel like he could somehow save her. He didn't say a word. Then I nodded. "Okay." I turned and walked out. I drove home in silence. No music. No radio. Just the sound of the tires on the pavement. Sarah didn't follow me. She didn't call, didn't text, didn't even try to stop me when I walked out of that hotel room. And that told me everything I needed to know. I replayed the moment in my head over and over. The look on her face when she saw me. The way Daniel scrambled off the bed like a kid caught doing something he shouldn't. The guilt. The fear. The sheer shock that I had found them. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light. The kids were asleep. For a brief moment, I let myself sit there in the car, staring at the home we had built together. The home where we had once been a family. Now it was just a reminder of everything she had thrown away. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and sat at the kitchen table. I had spent years loving a woman who didn't love me back. That was the truth of it, wasn't it? Maybe she had loved me once. Maybe there was a time when she looked at me the way she had looked at Daniel today. But that time was gone. Had been gone for a long time. I had just been too blind to see it. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I heard the front door unlock. I didn't move. I just listened. Soft footsteps. A hesitant pause. Then the quiet creak of the door closing. She was home. For a moment, she didn't say anything. I could hear her breathing, could feel the weight of her presence behind me. Then finally, "David." I didn't respond. "Can we talk?" I let the silence stretch. Then, slowly, I turned my head to look at her. She looked like hell. Her hair was messy, her makeup smudged, her clothes wrinkled like she had been running her hands over them all night. And her eyes, God, her eyes. She looked afraid. But not of me. She was afraid of what came next. I exhaled slowly. "How long?" She winced, but this time she answered. 8 months. 8 months. Why? She ran a hand through her hair, looking away. "I don't know." I let out a sharp laugh. "Bullshit." She flinched. "David." "No," I snapped, standing up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "No more David, please. No more vague answers. No more half-truths. You owe me this much." I stepped closer, my voice low and sharp. Why him? Why now? She swallowed hard, her hands shaking at her sides. Because he sees me. I stared at her. Sees you? She nodded, her eyes glassy. You don't understand, David. I feel like I've been missing something for years. Like I've been living in a world that doesn't make sense. And then Daniel came back into my life, and suddenly, I felt like myself again. Yourself. I repeated, my voice hollow. She wiped at her eyes. I love you, David. I do. But it's not the same. It hasn't been for a long time. So instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix whatever the hell was wrong, you went behind my back and slept with him? She didn't respond. Because we both knew the answer. I took a shaky breath. Was it ever real? I asked quietly. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. But I don't think I was ever meant for this. She gestured vaguely around the room. For this life. For the routine. The stability. I felt like I was drowning, and I didn't know how to tell you. I stared at her, feeling like the last 10 years of my life had just been reduced to nothing. A wife who never really wanted this. A marriage that had been one-sided for God knows how long. A life I had spent building, for her, for our family, only for her to tell me she had never truly been happy. I was a good husband, I said, my voice hoarse. She nodded, covering her mouth with her hands. You were. You are. I laughed bitterly. Not good enough, though. David. I shook my head, stepping back. No, I don't want to hear it. Not anymore. I'll call a lawyer in the morning, I said. The next morning I woke up. My body ached. My head was pounding. And there was a dull, empty space in my chest where something used to be. Sarah was already up. I could hear her moving around the kitchen, making coffee like it was just another day. Like she hadn't completely destroyed our marriage the night before. For a brief second, I almost convinced myself it was all a dream, that I could get up, walk into that kitchen, kiss my wife on the cheek, and pretend we were still the family we used to be. But then I remembered. 8 months. Hotel rooms. I feel like I can finally breathe when I'm with you. I swung my legs out of bed and sat there for a moment, staring at the floor. Today was the beginning of the end. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and found the number of a divorce lawyer a friend had recommended years ago. Back when another guy in our circle went through this same nightmare. Back then, I had felt sorry for him. Thought it was a shame his wife had betrayed him. Now I was him. I called the number. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message. Then I stood up, exhaled, and walked into the kitchen. Sarah was standing at the counter, stirring her coffee. When she saw me, she hesitated. Morning. Her voice was cautious, like she wasn't sure which version of me she'd be dealing with today. I pulled a chair out and sat down, watching her. We need to tell the kids. She stiffened. David, we're not dragging this out, I said, my voice cold. I called a lawyer. We'll figure out the details later. But they deserve to know. They don't have to know everything, she murmured. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped me. You mean they don't have to know why this is happening? She flinched but didn't argue. I ran a hand over my face, exhausted beyond belief. I won't destroy their image of you, Sarah. I won't tell them what you did. But I'm not going to lie to them either. She swallowed hard. Okay. It was the first time she hadn't fought me. No excuses. No deflections. Just quiet acceptance. Maybe, in her own way, she had already made peace with this. I wished I could say the same. We sat the kids down that evening. Our son, Jake, was 12. Our daughter, Lily, was 9. Too young to fully understand, too old for us to sugarcoat it. Sarah sat next to me on the couch, hands clenched in her lap. I could feel her shaking. I was calm. Too calm. I had spent the whole day preparing for this, rehearsing the words, trying to find the least painful way to shatter their world. There's something we need to talk about, I started, keeping my voice steady. Your mom and we've decided we're not going to stay married. Jake frowned, looking between us. What do you mean? I took a deep breath. It means we're getting a divorce, buddy. Lily's face fell immediately. Jake just stared. Sarah finally found her voice. We both love you very much, she said, her tone shaky. That will never change. Lily's lower lip trembled. But why? I looked at Sarah. This was her moment. Her chance to own up to what she had done. But she just sat there, silent. I turned back to the kids. Sometimes people change, I said carefully. Sometimes, Even when you love someone, things don't work out the way you hoped. Sarah sat rigid, tears in her eyes. Lily sniffled. So, what happens now? I reached out and took her little hand in mine. We're going to figure it out together, I promised. Jake's jaw clenched, his young mind working overtime to process everything. Are we staying here? I nodded. Yeah, buddy. You and Lily will stay here. I'll be here. Nothing will change for you guys. Sarah finally spoke. I'll be moving out soon. Jake's face hardened. Where? Sarah hesitated. I don't know yet. I saw it in her eyes. She knew exactly where she was going. And it sure as hell wasn't a place of her own. Jake saw it too. He stood up abruptly. I'm going to my room. Lily followed. Me too. Sarah called after them, but they ignored her. When they were gone, she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. I sat there watching her cry, and for the first time in our entire marriage, I felt absolutely nothing. Sarah moved out a week later. She packed in a quiet, tense silence, breaking it only to ask about logistics. Who would pick up the kids from school? How would we spend our weekends? Would we keep a joint account for their expenses? She asked all the right questions, the practical ones. But she never once asked how I was doing. Never once tried to explain. Never once told me she was sorry. Maybe she thought it didn't matter. Maybe she knew that apologizing wouldn't change anything. Or maybe, deep down, she just didn't regret it. The kids barely spoke to her that week. Especially Jake. He refused to even be in the same room with her. He wasn't stupid. He might not know the whole truth, but he knew that she was the one who had broken this family up. The morning she left, Lily hugged her and cried. Sarah pressed herself against her, whispering something I didn't want to hear. Jake stepped back, crossing his arms, his face hard and unreadable. When Sarah turned to him, he didn't move. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak. And that was what broke her the most. Jake, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Please. He looked her straight in the eyes and said, just go. Sarah let out a quiet sob, then turned to me. I stared at her, waiting. Was she going to say something? A final plea? A final attempt to justify all this? But she just nodded. A small, pathetic gesture. Then she grabbed her suitcase and walked out the door. I didn't watch her go. I just turned, closed the door, and locked it behind her. And just like that, our marriage was over. In the weeks that followed, I expected to feel the full weight of it. Grief, anger, unbearable loneliness. But instead, I felt lighter. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking on eggshells. I wasn't chasing a woman who didn't love me. I wasn't trying to hold on to something that had been crumbling for years. I was free. The kids had adjusted in their own way. Lily missed her, of course. She still visited Sarah on weekends, still called her mommy, in that quiet, hopeful voice that broke my heart. And Jake? He wanted nothing to do with her. He refused to go there, refused to answer her texts. I didn't force him. First Sarah tried. She called, left messages, sent long emails, trying to explain things in a way that didn't make her look like a villain. But Jake wasn't interested in her explanations. One night, about a month after she left, she showed up at the house unannounced. I opened the door and saw her standing there, small and unsure. Can I come in? She asked quietly. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She looked around the house as if expecting something different. But it was still the same, only now it was mine. She looked at me. How are you? What do you want, Sarah? I want to see Jake. He doesn't want to see you. She winced. David, please. I know I screwed up, but he's my son. You should have thought of that before you left that family, I said coldly. Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't leave. I just... What? I asked sharply. What did you do, Sarah? Tell me. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Go home, Sarah. Her face scrunched up. I'm home. I stared at her. No, not home. It was home. But you left. And you can't go back just because you don't like the consequences. She let out a broken sob, covering her mouth. And for a second, just a second, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the text messages, the hotel rooms, the way she'd looked at him. She wiped her face and took a shaky breath. If he ever wants to talk, please tell him I love him. I didn't answer. She stood there for a moment longer, waiting for something that would never happen. Then, finally, she turned and walked away. Forever. Months passed. Then a year. Sarah faded into the background of my life. She and Daniel didn't last. I heard from mutual friends that he was back with his wife. Maybe she forgave him. Maybe she didn't know. As for Sarah, well, she got exactly what she wanted. She was free. And me? I moved on. I focused on my kids. Focused on rebuilding. Focused on becoming the kind of man who would never ask for someone else's love again. And for the first time in a long, long time, I was happy. Thanks for listening to my story. And tell me, what would you do if you were me?